The foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday. Daniel Holt found it tucked between an electric bill and a supermarket flyer, pressed flat against the mailbox like it was ashamed of itself. He stood in the driveway in his work boots, snow collecting on his shoulders, and read it 3 times. The words didn't change. 30 days to vacate. He folded the letter in half, then in half again. He slid it into the inside pocket of his coat, right against his chest, where it sat like a second heartbeat, cold, insistent, wrong. The house behind him was a Craftsman built in 1962, white paint peeling at the corners. A front porch that listed slightly to the left because he'd never had time to fix the rotted support beam. 2 bedrooms, 1.5 baths. A kitchen window that fogged up every morning when he made coffee, so thick with steam that for a few minutes the outside world disappeared entirely. He'd bought it with Claire 6 years ago. It had been her idea. "It has good bones," she'd said, standing in the empty living room with her arms crossed and her eyes lit up the way they got when she was already seeing something that wasn't there yet. Everything worth keeping has good bones. Claire had been dead for 4 years. The bones were all that remained. Daniel went inside. The girls were at the kitchen table, Maisie, 7, working a puzzle with the concentration of a surgeon, and Lila, 10, finishing homework she'd already been over twice. She was like that, precise. She got it from her mother. "You're late," Lila said without looking up. Roads were bad. He pulled off his coat and hung it on the hook by the door. The letter crinkled against his chest. "Smells good in here." Maisie made grilled cheese. "I made grilled cheese," Maisie confirmed, proud. One corner was burned black. She'd set out a plate for him already, cut diagonally, the way he'd taught her. He sat down and ate it without complaint. It tasted like the best thing he'd ever had. Daniel Holt was 36 years old and currently held 3 jobs. Monday through Friday he worked the 6 a.m. shift at Garrison's lumber yard, loading and sorting inventory until 2 in the afternoon. Tuesday and Thursday evenings he drove freight for a regional logistics company, 4-hour routes through the dark. Weekends he picked up whatever shifts the hardware store on Millward Avenue would give him, which lately had been fewer because the new manager was 22 and liked to give weekends to his friends. He hadn't slept more than 5 consecutive hours in 14 months. He knew this because he'd started counting. The money was not enough. It was never quite enough. There was the mortgage 3 months behind, and the utilities, and Lila's prescription, and the cost of keeping Maisie in the after-school program so she wasn't home alone until 6. He'd sold Claire's car in the fall. He'd sold his guitar in October. He was down to the bones now. After dinner he washed the dishes and put the girls to bed, reading Maisie half a chapter of the book. She'd chosen something about a rabbit who kept misplacing her hat, and then sitting on the edge of Lila's bed in the dark until her breathing slowed and deepened. She still needed that. She didn't like to admit it. He went to the kitchen and took the letter out of his coat pocket and flattened it on the table under the one working overhead light. He sat with it for a long time. The man he owed money to was named Preston Garfield, local lender. Operated out of an office on the 2nd floor of a building on the square that also housed a dentist and a tax preparation service. Garfield had refinanced Daniel's mortgage 2 years ago when the bank rejected his application, and the terms had seemed workable at the time, or at least survivable, but there were fees buried in the language Daniel hadn't understood until it was too late, and the interest had compounded in ways that felt less like finance and more like a trap closing. Garfield had come by the week before. He'd parked his clean black SUV at the curb and walked up the path with his hands in his pockets, a man performing casualness. He'd stood on the porch and looked at the house the way a developer looks at an empty lot. "I could make this easy, Daniel," he'd said. "Sign the property over now, walk away with something in your pocket. Enough to rent for a year, maybe. Start fresh." Daniel had looked at him for a long moment. "Get off my porch," he'd said. Garfield had smiled, the way certain men smile when they already know how a story ends. 30 days, he'd said pleasantly, and walked back to his car. Now, Daniel sat at the kitchen table in the silence of the house and thought about his daughters asleep in their rooms. About the way Lila double-checked her homework, about Maisie's burned grilled cheese cut diagonally. He thought about Claire. Everything worth keeping has good bones. Okay, he said to the empty kitchen. It wasn't agreement. It wasn't surrender. It was something older than either the sound a man makes when he's decided to keep standing, even though he has no idea how. He went to the window. Outside, the snow was coming down steady. The street was empty. The town of Grover Mills, population 4,000 and shrinking, slept under white. His phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number. He stared at it until it stopped. It buzzed again 30 seconds later. Same number. He let it ring. Whoever it was didn't leave a message. He stood at the window a while longer, watching the snow fall through the yellow light of the street lamp, and then he went to bed. He didn't sleep. There was a photograph in a shoebox at the back of his closet. He'd taken it out exactly once since moving to Grover Mills the night Claire died, when he'd been sitting on the bathroom floor at 3 in the morning, and the grief had no shape yet, just weight, and he'd needed something to hold. He'd looked at it for a long time. Then he'd put it back in the shoebox and pushed it to the very back of the shelf where the ceiling sloped down, behind his winter coats, behind a box of Claire's books he still couldn't donate. In the photograph, Daniel was 28. His hair was longer. He was standing in front of a motorcycle, a Heritage Softail, midnight blue, with his arm around a woman who was laughing at something just out of frame. 12 other women stood in a rough crescent behind them, most of them laughing too, squinting into Sonoran desert sunlight. They were in front of a roadside diner somewhere in Arizona, still dusty from the ride, helmets under arms, all wearing the same jacket. Black leather, no club patch, just a small iron compass rose above the left breast pocket. The Meridians, that was what they'd called themselves, though never publicly, never in any official capacity. It wasn't a club in the formal sense, no charter, no dues, no hierarchy beyond the informal architecture of trust that forms between people who have ridden into enough bad situations together and come out the other side. It was 12 women and 1 man who had met in pieces over 3 years, through shared roads and shared trouble, drawn together by something Daniel had never been able to name precisely, but recognized whenever he was around them. A quality of attention, a way of being present in the world. He'd been the only man, and it had never once been strange. He'd never thought to question it. His role had been practical. He was good at logistics, at reading terrain, at planning routes, at anticipating problems before they materialized. He'd grown up in rural Montana, son of a mechanic father and a mother who taught him that the most useful thing a person could do in any situation was pay attention. He'd served 2 years in the Army, left on good terms, and spent the years afterward building a life that moved, literally, never staying anywhere more than 8 months until he met Claire at a gas station outside Flagstaff. And she'd asked him where he was going, and he'd said he didn't really know, and she'd said that sounds exhausting, and he'd laughed for the first time in what felt like a year. He'd brought Claire into the group. She'd fit immediately. She'd had the quality. The accident that killed her had nothing to do with riding. A wet road in February, an oncoming driver who crossed the center line, 4 seconds. That was all it took. 4 seconds and a wet road, and Daniel found himself a widower in a hospital parking lot in the dark. Not knowing how to call the people who needed to know, not knowing how to drive home, not knowing how to be the thing he was now. He'd called Reese. Reese Calloway was the woman in the photograph, the one laughing. She'd been the group's practical center even before Daniel stepped back steady, unsentimental, wickedly competent. She'd driven 300 miles to meet him at the hospital. She'd sat with him through the night. She'd helped him make the calls. He'd told her he was done. Not just with riding, with everything the riding represented. The movement, the freedom, the looseness. He had 2 daughters, and they needed a father who was present and grounded. not a man who chased horizons. He was going to be a different kind of person now. Reese had looked at him with those dark, level eyes and said, "Okay." She hadn't argued. She hadn't said "you're wrong" or "you're running" or any of the things that would have been true. She'd said "okay" and hugged him. And then she'd driven home. He'd moved to Grover Mills 8 months later. His cousin had offered him work at the lumber yard, affordable housing, a community small enough that the girls could grow up knowing their neighbors, a place to put down the bones of something permanent. He'd changed his number a year in. It hadn't felt like hiding. It had felt like necessity. The unknown calls started 3 days ago. He didn't know how they'd found the new number. He didn't know what he would have said if he'd picked up. He lay in the dark on the night of the foreclosure notice and stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind push snow against the window, and for the first time in 4 years he thought clearly and without flinching about who he used to be. Not a hero. Not anything so clean as that. Just a man who'd learned to be useful. And a long time ago, that usefulness had mattered to people he cared about. He wondered if it still counted. If things done years ago in other lives still had weight. Outside, the wind was picking up. He was in the kitchen at 11:47 when he heard it. Low at first, a vibration more than a sound, felt in the chest before it reached the ears. He set down his coffee cup. The sound grew, layered, multiple engines, deep-throated, running in tight formation. Coming from the east, from the state highway, which meant they'd come through the mountain pass in a blizzard. Nobody came through the mountain pass in a blizzard unless they had a specific reason. The vibration resolved into sound, the sound into direction, and the direction was unmistakable. They were coming here. Daniel was at the window when the headlights swept across the wall. He counted them without thinking. Old habit 1, 2, 4, 8. More than that. They came down Sycamore Street in 2 columns, careful and precise despite the snow, and pulled up along the curb in front of his house and went quiet one by one until the last engine cut off and the silence crashed back in like a wave. He could see their shapes in the yellow streetlight. 20 motorcycles, 20 riders. Dismounting, steam rising from their jackets in the cold, moving without hurry, with the unhurried confidence of people who know exactly where they are and why. He stood very still. A knock at the door. 3 times, firm. Not aggressive, authoritative. The knock of someone who expects the door to open. He checked the hallway. The girls' doors were closed. He went to the front door and opened it. She was standing on the second porch step, which put her eyes level with his. Black helmet already off, tucked under her arm. Close-cropped, silver-streaked hair, dark eyes, the kind of face that had grown into its own angles. Behind her, on the porch and down the steps and across the snow-covered walk, 19 women stood in the cold and said nothing. He hadn't seen Reese Calloway in 4 years. She looked at him the same way she always had, like she was taking inventory, deciding what was present and what was missing. "You look terrible," she said. "You drove through a blizzard," he said. "Mountain Pass was manageable." She paused. "The bottom of your porch steps definitely aren't. You've got ice building up under the snow there. Somebody's going to break an ankle." Reese. Daniel. A beat of silence between them. 4 years wide. "How did you find the new number?" he asked. "We have a person," she said. "Of course you do." He stepped back from the door. They filled his living room and kitchen and spilled out onto the porch in the cold. 20 women in black leather with snow melting in their hair, and his house, which had been so empty for so long, felt suddenly, impossibly full. Reese took the chair across from him at the kitchen table. The others gave them space without being asked. "How much?" Reese said. "I didn't call you." "No. You didn't pick up." She looked at him steadily. "How much?" he told her. The number, the back payments, the fees, Garfield's terms, all of it. It came out flatly, without drama, because he'd been carrying it alone long enough that it had lost its shape. It was just a number now, just a fact about his life, like the mileage on his truck, or the age of his water heater. Reese listened without expression. When he finished, she nodded once. "That's manageable," she said. "I'm not taking money from you." "I know you're not." "Then what are you here for?" She was quiet for a moment. In the living room, one of the other women had apparently found Maisie's half-finished puzzle on the coffee table and was quietly working on it. The domestic absurdity of that almost made him smile. "Do you remember Tucson?" Reese said. He remembered Tucson. The summer, he was 29. A job he'd taken that turned out to be something other than advertised. He'd been hired to consult on security logistics for a private event, and the event had turned out to be the kind of gathering where asking questions about what you were protecting got you escorted outside at gunpoint. He'd gone back for Reese and two of the others who were inside because they'd trusted him when he said the job was clean, and extracting 4 people from a building full of armed men with no backup and no plan had taken approximately everything he had. They'd all gotten out. Nobody had been seriously hurt. He'd never talked about it. "I remember," he said. "And Albuquerque," Reese said. "And the thing in Colorado with Deb's situation. And 300 separate moments where you were the person who showed up." She put her hands flat on the table. "We don't come with a ledger, Daniel. That's not what this is. We're not here because you've earned points. We're here because you're in trouble and your family, and we don't leave family to drown." I walked away. "You took time," she said. "That's different." He looked at her. At the lines in her face that hadn't been there 4 years ago. At the silver in her hair. "There's a man named Garfield," he said. "I know. We looked into him before we left." She said it without any particular emphasis, the way you'd say, "I checked the weather before we left. He's done this to 6 other families in this county in the last 4 years. 4 of them lost their properties. He buys them at below market and flips them within 18 months. He's got a relationship with at least 2 people in the county assessor's office. How long did it take you to find all that?" "About 40 minutes. She allowed herself a small, precise smile. Wren is very good at what she does. From the living room, a woman with close-cropped red hair and a laptop open on her knees raised a hand without looking up. That would be Wren. Daniel didn't recognize her. New blood. In the 4 years he'd been gone. "You said 6 families," he said. "6 that we found. I want to help them too." Reese looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, something careful and old. "There he is," she said quietly. He didn't know what to say to that. He looked at his hands on the table. Outside, the snow was still falling, but lighter now. The storm was thinning. "The girls are asleep," he said. "You should stay. It's too bad to ride back through the pass tonight." "We were planning on it," Reese said. "We brought sleeping bags." Of course they had. By morning, the news had traveled. Grover Mills was not a large town. It did not take long for word to spread that 20 motorcycles had come through in the night and parked outside Daniel Holt's house on Sycamore Street, and that the riders, all women, people said, all of them women, were still there at daybreak, some of them apparently making breakfast in his kitchen, while others sat on his porch in the cold with coffee, watching the street with the unhurried calm of people who are exactly where they mean to be. By 8 in the morning, Frank Dodds from 3 houses down had walked his dog past twice more slowly than usual. By 9, Carol Hennessy from the church committee had found a reason to check her mailbox 4 times. By 10, a patrol car had idled at the corner of Sycamore and Birch for 11 minutes before moving on. Deputy Marcus Weller came to the door at 10:30. He was young, polite, and visibly uncertain about what authority he was exercising. He stood on the porch and explained that he'd received calls from concerned residents. Reese opened the door before Daniel could get there. She was drinking coffee. She looked at the deputy the way she looked at everything, without particular interest, without hostility. "Concerned about what?" she asked. Weller looked past her at the motorcycles lined up along the curb. "Just checking in. Making sure everything's all right." "Everything's fine," Reese said. We're visiting a friend. Is there a town ordinance against motorcycles on a public street? No, ma'am. Is there an ordinance against visiting friends? No, ma'am. Then I think we're okay. She sipped her coffee. You're welcome to come in. Daniel's making eggs. Weller left without coming in. The girls had met the group over breakfast. Maisie had attached herself immediately and with total commitment to a woman named Petra, who was 6 feet tall, had sleeve tattoos, and turned out to have an extraordinary patience for explaining how motorcycle engines worked to 7-year-olds. Lila had been more cautious, sitting at the edge of the kitchen with her juice and observing, which was how she always processed new things. By the time Daniel had finished washing the pans, she had cornered Wren and was asking careful, serious questions about computers. He watched all of this from the kitchen doorway and felt something shift in his chest. Not healing nothing so easy as that. More like a door opening in a room he'd sealed. Garfield came at noon. He parked his black SUV at the end of the drive and got out with 2 other men, not his usual alone and pleasant routine. He walked up the cleared path someone had shoveled it at dawn. Daniel hadn't asked who and stopped at the foot of the porch steps. 6 women were on the porch. They didn't move. They didn't say anything. They simply looked at him with the patient attention of people who have plenty of time and no particular anxiety about how it gets spent. Garfield's expression flickered. Just once. Then he assembled his smile. Daniel, he called, past the women on the porch. We should talk. You can talk to me, Reese said from the porch railing. I'd like to speak with the homeowner. The homeowner is busy. Garfield looked at the motorcycles. At the women on the porch. At the 2 men behind him who were suddenly less certain of themselves than they'd been in the car. Who are you people? He said. There was something in his voice, not quite fear. The thing that comes before fear. Friends? Reese said. Old ones. Garfield stood there another moment. Then he went back to his car. He didn't come back that day. That evening, around the kitchen table, Wren laid out what she'd found. Preston Garfield had been operating in the county for 11 years. The foreclosure scheme was methodical. He targeted properties where the owners were behind on payments, offered refinancing through his private lending company at terms that appeared manageable, buried compounding fees in the fine print, and then leveraged the debt to force foreclosure when the owner inevitably fell behind. He'd acquired 9 properties this way. 6 were already sold. 3, including Daniel's, were currently in process. He had a cousin in the county assessor's office named Brian Taggart, who had repeatedly assessed Garfield's acquired properties at below market value, reducing the tax burden during the holding period and inflating the apparent profit margin on resale. He had a relationship with Deputy Weller's supervisor, Captain Harold Innes, the nature of which Wren described carefully as transactional. He's not untouchable, Wren said. She was young, 26, maybe 27, with the very specific confidence of someone who has never been wrong about anything she could measure. He's just been operating in a small enough pond that nobody's bothered to look. Who do we take this to? Daniel asked. State AG's office has a consumer fraud division. I've been building the file this afternoon. She turned her laptop around. The document was already 40 pages. But that takes time. Months, maybe. I have 30 days. Less now, Reese said. He looked at her. He filed an expedited motion this afternoon, she said. I had a call with an attorney in the city. He's claiming there are additional penalties that accelerate the timeline. It's probably not legally valid, but it will take time to fight, time you may not have. The table went quiet. Daniel put his hands on the table and looked at them. He thought about the letter in his coat pocket, about Lila's prescription, about Maisie's puzzle. What does he actually want? He said. The property, Reese said. There's a development group that's been buying along this street. He's got a contract contingent on acquiring 4 more addresses. Yours is one of them. Development group? Daniel said. Which one? Wren told him. He knew the name. Everyone in Grover Mills knew the name. A regional developer out of the city, The kind of operation that came into small towns with language about revitalization and growth opportunity and left behind condominiums that nobody who'd grown up there could afford. Daniel sat back in his chair. He needs the property by a specific date, he said. It wasn't a question. 60 days, Wren said. The development contract expires if he doesn't deliver. So if we can keep the property past 60 days, the contract collapses, and so does his leverage with the developer. Without that contract, he's got properties he overpaid to acquire and a fraud exposure he can't contain. Wren allowed herself a small, satisfied expression. He's not in a strong position. He's in a pressured position. He just doesn't know we know that yet. Something clarified in Daniel's thinking. The fog of desperation that had been sitting on him for months, the weight of a problem with no visible edges, began to resolve into shape, into something he could see and therefore work with. This was a problem. Problems had solutions. Okay, he said. He looked around the table. What do we do? The next 3 days moved fast. Wren filed a formal complaint with the State Consumer Fraud Division, attaching the full documentation and a cover letter that Reese's attorney, a woman named Sylvia Marsh, who operated out of the city and had a reputation for enjoying exactly this kind of case, had spent an evening drafting. The complaint cited 6 affected families, documented the relationship between Garfield and his cousin at the assessor's office, and included 3 years of property transaction records that told a story which, once assembled, was remarkably clear. Sylvia also filed a motion challenging the expedited foreclosure timeline, citing procedural irregularities in the original refinancing documentation. She expected the motion to buy at least 3 weeks. Meanwhile, Reese made calls. She was quiet about what the calls were too, but Daniel noticed. A journalist at the state paper who covered municipal finance, a county commissioner who had run twice, unsuccessfully, against the incumbent closely associated with Garfield's network, a community advocacy organization in the city that had been tracking predatory lending patterns in rural counties for 2 years and was, as it turned out, already aware of Garfield's name. "You've done this before," Daniel said to her on the second evening, catching her on the porch alone. "We've had practice," she said. "What happened the other times?" She looked out at the street, where 2 of the group, Kelsey and a woman named Darrow, who was built like a former college athlete and moved like one, were doing something industrious with a ladder and his loose porch gutters. He hadn't asked them to. They'd just noticed and started. "Mixed results," Reese said. "Sometimes you can dismantle a thing. Sometimes you can only limit how much damage it does." She paused. This one we can dismantle. The structure is there. It just needs to be seen." On the 3rd day, Garfield escalated. He'd apparently assessed the situation and decided that patience was no longer serving him. At 6 in the evening, someone put a brick through Daniel's mailbox. It was clearly a message. Not an accident, the brick had been thrown with precision, and there was nothing inside worth stealing. An hour later, Maisie came running in from the backyard, saying that a car had stopped at the alley fence and a man had looked at her through the slats before driving away. Daniel was on his feet before she'd finished the sentence. He was outside in 8 seconds. The alley was empty. He stood in the cold with his pulse loud in his ears and looked at the fence and the tire tracks in the alley snow. Reese was beside him. "They're trying to rattle you," she said. "They rattled me. That's reasonable. Somebody looked at your kid. Being rattled is the appropriate response." She put a hand on his arm. "But here's what we're not going to do. We're not going to react without thinking. We're going to be smart." He took a breath. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to end this," he said. "Not in 30 days. Now. Then we need him to make a mistake." He looked at her. "He's scared," she said. "Scared men make mistakes. We just need to push the right pressure point at the right time." That night, Wren sent the full documentation packet to the journalist. Not as a tip. As a complete story, sourced and verified, with Sylvia's legal assessment attached. The journalist, a woman named Carla Price, who had been covering rural financial fraud for 8 years and had, according to Wren, he been looking for exactly this kind of documented case, published it online at 11 p.m. By midnight, it had been forwarded to the county commissioner. By 1 a.m., the State Consumer Fraud Division had acknowledged receipt of the formal complaint. By 2 a.m., Brian Taggart at the assessor's office had called Preston Garfield 3 times. Daniel knew all this because Wren was still awake at 2 a.m., tracking it on her laptop at his kitchen table with the focused satisfaction of someone watching dominoes fall. "Go to sleep," she told him without looking up. "I can't sleep," he said. "Neither can Garfield," she said. "But you'll be more useful tomorrow if you try." He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. The kitchen was warm, the rest of the house quiet, and from the living room came the faint sound of 2 women speaking low Petra and a woman named Simone. He thought, their voices the steady murmur of people who had learned to keep each other company in long hours. "How did you end up here?" he asked Wren. "With the group." She looked up briefly. "Reese found me in Boise. I was doing security consulting, mostly private clients, some of it not completely above board." She returned to her screen. "She offered me something more interesting." "What did she offer you?" "Honest work," Wren said. "That sounds simpler than it is, in my experience." He thought about that. "The night with Maisie," he said. "The car at the fence." Wren nodded. "Were you tracking it?" "From the moment we arrived, I had a passive monitor on the traffic camera at Birch and Main. The truck had been through twice before that day. Different plates they swapped, but the same weight profile and the same subtle wobble in the front left axle." She said this with the mild authority of someone describing the weather. "I flagged it to Darrow and Kelsey before the 3rd pass. They were in the alley 14 seconds after Maisie came inside." He sat with that. 14 seconds. "Thank you," he said. She gave him a brief, precise look. "That's what we're here for." He went to bed. He slept. Garfield came at 7 in the morning with 4 men, a lawyer, and the attitude of someone who had decided that aggressive was the only remaining option. It was a tactical error. Daniel recognized it immediately. The man had let his anxiety dictate his move. When anxiety dictates, you come too fast and too hard, and you show everything you have, and when you show everything, the other side knows exactly what they're working with. He opened the door before they reached the porch. Reese and 4 others were already outside, not blocking, not threatening, just present. Kelsey was sitting on the porch, railing with coffee. Darrow was at the top of the steps with her arms crossed and her face neutral. 3 others were visible at the corners of the house, their presence casual and absolute. Garfield's lawyer opened with the acceleration clause. Reese's attorney, Sylvia Marsh, had driven up the night before, at her own initiative, because she had read the news article and decided she wanted to be on site for the morning, listened to the full presentation with her hands folded, and then responded for 12 minutes without notes or pause. She cited 3 case precedents in the state's consumer finance statutes. She named 2 specific procedural violations in the original loan documentation. She noted that the State Consumer Fraud Division had opened a formal inquiry at 8 that morning. She'd gotten the confirmation email at 8:17 and had printed it out for convenience, and that in her professional judgment, any attempt to execute a foreclosure under current circumstances would expose Garfield's company to significant additional liability. She handed the copy across to Garfield's lawyer. The lawyer read it. His expression shifted. Garfield stood very still. He was looking past all of them at Daniel, and Daniel looked back at him. And in that moment, something passed between them that was older and simpler than lawyers and documents and acceleration clauses, just 2 men, and the acknowledgement of who held what. "You've made an enemy," Garfield said. "I had a problem," Daniel said. "I solved it." "That's all." Garfield's jaw tightened. He turned to leave. "Mr. Garfield," Reese said. He stopped. "The other 5 families," she said. "The ones in the same situation as Mr. Holt. You have the contact information. I'd suggest reaching out to them today about restructuring arrangements. Today is better than tomorrow." Garfield looked at her for a long moment. Then he left. No one on the porch said anything for a moment. The black SUV pulled away, the lawyer's car behind it. Sylvia Marsh made a note on her legal pad. "That went well," she said professionally. Kelsey laughed first. It was a sudden, pure sound that broke the silence completely, and then it spread, and Daniel stood on the porch of his house in the cold morning sun and felt something break open in his chest, not painfully, not the way grief breaks, more like the way a window breaks when you've been in a sealed room too long and you finally get the latch open. He sat down on the porch steps. After a moment, Reese sat beside him. "You knew this would work," he said. "I knew we had a strong position," she said. "Those aren't the same thing." "Close enough." She was quiet for a moment. The sun was full now, bouncing hard off the snow, the kind of bright winter morning that makes you squint and feel, despite everything, like the world intends something good. "I need to tell you something," she said. He looked at her. "After you left, we almost dissolved. That first year." She said it flatly, without blame. "People drifted. The center held because of the connection we'd built, but we had to rebuild around it, find out who we were without you in the middle of things. I didn't know that. I know you didn't. I'm not saying it to make you feel guilty. I'm saying it because I want you to know what you built, what it cost to keep." She looked out at the street, what it's been worth. He didn't know what to say. He rarely did, when things were true. "Who leads now?" he asked. "I do," she said. "Mostly. We're more distributed than before. Better that way, honestly." A pause. "You taught us that. That the structure only works if it doesn't depend on one person." He thought about that. About Claire, who had seen this in him before he'd understood it himself, the part of him that was built to build things, to be the center of a network of trust, to be useful in the way that mattered. Everything worth keeping has good bones. "I've been gone a long time," he said. "You've been here a long time," she said. That night, Garfield made one final move. Not with lawyers, not with paperwork. The call came in at 10:15, Daniel's attorney, Sylvia, calling from her car, voice tight with the specific tension of a professional outside her normal territory. "I need you to know something," she said. "I just received a call from a source who has reason to be credible. There are 2 men on their way to your property. Garfield's done with legal options. This isn't my specialty, but you need to be careful." He thanked her. He hung up. He went to find Reese. She was already in the living room. The others were already in various states of alert, the way a team moves when information has distributed faster than anyone could explain. He'd seen it before. That quality, the way a group of people who know each other deeply can communicate without words, reading posture and pace and the set of someone's jaw from across a room. "I heard," Reese said. "Ren monitors certain frequencies," she said. It was not an elaboration. "What do we do?" "We position," she said. "Not to engage, to be visible. To make it clear that whatever they came to do would happen in front of 20 witnesses. Not to an isolated man with 2 sleeping kids. It happened at 11:40. A truck pulled up 2 houses down. 2 men got out. They stood in the street and looked at the house, and saw every light on in the house, every porch light blazing. 12 women distributed across the front yard and along the fence line. Visible, not concealed, not menacing, just present. The way 20 people who have no anxiety about being seen are present. A ring of witnesses. A ring of record. The men stood in the street for 4 minutes. Then they got back in the truck and drove away. Daniel watched them go from the front window. He stayed at the window a long time after the truck's taillights had vanished around the corner. The street reformed itself in their absence, just a street again, snow-packed, lit by 2 working lampposts and the cold half-moon. Nothing to indicate anything had almost happened here. Nothing to mark the moment. He thought about Garfield. About the calculus of a man like that, someone who had built a system on the assumption that the people he targeted would be alone. That isolation was the precondition for exploitation. The math only worked when no one was watching, when the cost of looking was higher than the cost of looking away. He'd spent 4 years in something like that logic himself. Not the predatory version, nothing like Garfield's, but the logic of a man who had contracted his world to what was manageable, who had decided, with good reasons and real grief behind the decision, that smaller was safer, that the perimeter you could defend was the only one worth holding. He'd been wrong about that. He'd been right about so many other things, about what his daughters needed, about what grief required, about the way a life rebuilt on solid ground is worth the work, but he'd been wrong about the perimeter. A hand on his shoulder. "Reese, they're not coming back tonight," she said. "I know." Garfield knows the window is closing. He doesn't have options left. What just happened? Those men in the truck, that was panic. Panic makes one more bad move, and then it stops. How do you know? She was quiet for a moment. Because I've seen it before, and because I know the profile. He's not violent in his soul, he's transactional. Violence is expensive and it leaves evidence and it ruins the story a man like that tells himself about who he is. He crossed to it because he's desperate. But desperate has an end. Daniel turned from the window. The living room was full women in sleeping bags on the floor. On the couch, on the air mattress someone had produced from somewhere. Boots in a line by the door. Jackets on every hook, overflowing onto the dining chairs. The house was so full it almost creaked with it. He'd lived in this house for 3 years, feeling its emptiness at every corner. The extra bedroom. The hook that used to hold Claire's coat. The silences between one room and the next. It wasn't empty now. About the choices he'd made, the walls he'd built, the ways he'd made himself smaller and quieter and more manageable. For good reasons and true ones. He thought about his daughters asleep upstairs in the house he was keeping. He thought about the bones. He went outside. The cold was sharp, the air crystalline after the storm, the kind of cold that makes everything feel exactly as solid as it is. He stood on the porch, and Reese came to stand beside him, and neither of them said anything for a while. The stars were out. That particular kind of winter, sky high and clear and infinite. As if the storm had scrubbed it clean. "Thank you," he said. "Don't," she said. "I mean it. So do I. Don't thank me. Just be here. That's enough." He looked up at the sky. Around him, in ones and twos, the others drifted onto the porch. Petra and Kelsey and Darrow and Wren and 11 others, standing in the cold, looking out at the cleared street and the star-scattered dark. No one said anything. There was nothing that needed saying. This was the thing he'd forgotten. The thing he'd buried in a shoebox with a photograph. That belonging wasn't a transaction. It wasn't earned and spent and reconciled. It was something that accrued between people over time, in moments of difficulty and in moments of nothing in particular, in burned grilled cheese cut diagonally, in motorcycle engines in the dark, in sitting on a porch in the cold at midnight, because you were somewhere you were supposed to be. He'd spent 4 years being a father, which was the right and necessary thing. He had not known, had not let himself know that it was possible to also still be this. The formal inquiry opened 3 weeks later. By the end of the month, Garfield's company had received a cease and desist order from the State Consumer Fraud Division, and the county DA's office had opened a parallel investigation into Brian Taggart's conduct at the assessor's office. Sylvia Marsh took on 4 of the 5 other affected families pro bono. She said it was because the legal theory was interesting. Wren, who had met Sylvia by then and seemed to regard her with the cool assessment of one highly competent person recognizing another, said it was because Sylvia was the kind of attorney who specifically sought out cases that mattered and did not much care to admit it. 2 of the families recovered their properties outright. The other 2 reached negotiated settlements that left them in significantly better situations than before. The 5th family had already relocated. Sylvia was pursuing a damages claim on their behalf. The development contract expired without being executed. Preston Garfield's lending company suspended operations pending the investigation. Grover Mills continued to be a small town in winter. Population 4,000, the kind of place where news traveled on foot, and the diner on the square had been run by the same family for 3 generations. And the snow came down the same way. It always had quiet, steady, without apology. The morning the group prepared to leave, Daniel made pancakes for 22 people and ran out of batter after 14 and had to start over, while Petra and Maisie debated the correct ratio of butter to syrup. And Lila and Wren sat at the kitchen table with Wren's laptop open, Lila asking questions with the methodical focus she applied to everything, Wren answering with the patient precision of someone who had just realized she was talking to a genuine 10-year-old prodigy and was recalibrating appropriately. After breakfast, they loaded their bikes. Maisie stood on the porch and watched with the particular intensity of a 7-year-old memorizing something she doesn't have words for yet. She had, over the course of the week, collected an unexpected array of gifts. A small compass from Petra, a keychain from Kelsey, a hand-drawn diagram of a carburetor from a woman named Simone, who had apparently once worked as a mechanic, and found in Maisie an audience of pure, unfiltered enthusiasm. "Will you come back?" Maisie asked. Petra crouched down to her level. "We'll come back," she said. "Promise?" "On the road," Petra said. Which wasn't a standard formulation but was said with such certainty that Maisie accepted it immediately. She nodded like a treaty had been signed. Lila didn't ask if they'd come back. Lila had already exchanged contact information with Wren, who had handed over an email address without being asked and told Lila to message when she had more questions. Lila had said she would, in the tone of someone confirming a standing appointment. Daniel helped load the last of the gear. He worked down the line, same as always, checking straps, checking panniers, the old muscle memory of 100 departures. At the end of the line, Reese was doing a final check of her own bike. He stood beside her for a moment. The street was pale with morning light, the snow bright and clean after the night's cold. "Come with us," she said. Not a plea, an offer, opened simply, without pressure. He looked at her. Then he looked at the porch, where Maisie was still standing with her new compass, examining it, and Lila had appeared in the doorway with her coat on, watching with the careful attention she gave everything that mattered. "Not today," he said. Reese nodded. "But not never," he said. She looked at him. Something settled in her face, not resolution, but recognition. The acknowledgement of something returning to its right shape. "I'll hold on to that," she said. She put on her helmet, swung up onto her bike. The engine turned over that sound, the deep, familiar percussion of it, moving through the cold air and the white morning and settling into his chest like something coming home. One by one, the engines came alive, 20 voices joining into a single low chord. The sound filled the street, filled the neighborhood, filled the still winter air. And then they were moving. Daniel stood at the edge of his porch and watched them go down Sycamore Street, around the corner onto Main. The sound carrying long after they were out of sight until it faded into the distance and then into silence. And the town was quiet again. Maisie slipped her hand into his. He looked down at her. She was watching the empty street with the open, serious expression of someone who has just witnessed something she will be thinking about for a very long time. "Bah." She said she'd picked up the word from something, he'd never quite figured out what, and used it sometimes when she meant something important. Who were they? He looked down the street. He thought of the photograph in the shoebox. Of Claire, laughing in desert sunlight. Of a man he used to be, who hadn't disappeared, who had been here the whole time, quiet and waiting, in the bones of things. "Family," he said. Maisie thought about this. She turned the compass over in her hands, finding north, the needle settling. "We have a lot of family," she said, with a 7-year-old's absolute certainty. "Yeah," Daniel said. He put his arm around her. Lila came and stood on his other side, Close, but not leaning, that was Lila's way. Present, without asking anything of the presence. He put his other arm around her too, and the three of them stood on the porch in the cold, bright morning, in the quiet that follows storms. The street was still. The snow was clean. He could feel the letter gone from his pocket, filed now, documented. Part of a legal proceeding that Sylvia Marsh was handling, with the particular pleasure of someone doing exactly what they're built for. He could feel the house behind him, its good bones, its listing porch, its kitchen window that steamed up every morning. He could feel the weight of what had almost gone and hadn't. He was 36 years old, and he had 2 daughters and a house with good bones and a family wider and stranger and more road-worn than most people ever knew to want. The compass needle settled. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, and somewhere, on a highway east of the mountains, 20 engines ran through the winter morning, carrying something back with them that they'd found in a small town, in a house on Sycamore Street, in the eyes of a man who'd spent 4 years learning how to stay. The road doesn't forget. It doesn't have to. It just waits.